Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you so much for joining our By Growers for Growers webinar today. I'm Jocelyn Phillips. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for the eastern half of the North American markets for Heliospectra. I'm so excited for all of you that have joined us today. I already see so many of my clients from the eastern half of the US and Atlantic Canada joining us. For those of you that may be joining us for the first time, or you may not know that much about Heliospectra, we are a Swedish company that was founded in 2006 by a plant scientist and biologist with one vision: to make crop production more intelligent and more resource efficient. Today, we have a global footprint with customers spanning 6 continents, and Heliospectra's goal is truly to be a global leader in innovation for horticultural lighting, custom light control systems, and specialized services for greenhouses, vertical farms, and controlled plant growth environments. At Heliospectra, our mission is to redefine nature's potential through innovation, technology, and most of all, meaningful partnerships. We have a commitment to deliver operational excellence to our growers and their business. So thank you so much for joining us today for our live Q&A session. Of course, as always, a few housekeeping items. The structure of this webinar has been different from the last few weeks, so we have no set agenda or topic, but we are truly dedicating this hour to you, our growers, hosting this webinar. Many of you have submitted questions in the categories such as lighting, environment, soil, and regulation. If you did not get a chance to submit your question, or you may have a new one, please locate the Q&A box on your screen. We are going to do our best to answer all questions within this hour. If we do not, we will follow up with you with either a phone call or an email to address those with you directly. And as always, we will have a copy of this webinar posted on our website, as with all the webinars, and it will be directly emailed to you afterwards. So next, I would like to present our gentlemen that are presenting for today. First, we have from Flemming and Singh, Dr. Singh. Ad has been working with organic farmers for over 25 years. Along with consulting with Flemming and Singh Cannabis, he serves as the commercial science specialist with Green Star. He's the chief agronomist with Green Gorilla and serves on many scientific advisory boards for LPs. Ad was recently invited to be on the Cannabis Quality Assurance Board and has been selected as a cannabis hero by both High Canada and Cannabis Amnesty. Next, I would like to introduce Randy Flemming from Flemming and Singh. Randy is very well known and well respected within the cannabis subculture of North America. Randy has been a recreational researcher of cannabis working towards a better understanding of the plant at all stages of the life cycle. Affectionately known as the pot whisperer, Randy contends that humility is the most important ingredient in cannabis cultivation, acknowledging that the plant in the living soil knows what to do. Randy brings nearly 30 years of experience to his clients, covering all aspects of cannabis, from breeding to propagation, cropping to curing, extraction to responsible consumption. And last but not least is our very own Ryan Wankel, our very good friend and second-generation cannabis grower. Ryan has led commercial teams at large-scale facilities in Denver. He has taken on multiple cultivation facilities from HPS to LED lighting solutions, and he now assists our customers in North America and Europe in developing strain-specific lighting strategies and understanding the benefits and environmental conditions of growing with LEDs. So, gentlemen, welcome. And let's begin with the questions for today. First, I'm going to bring in an environment question that is from Northern Canada. Give me a second here as I read through, guys. Most literature tells us to add CO2 during the vegetative state. Some even say to use CO2 during the first 2 weeks of flowering, 400 to 800 ppm. But in the flowering stage, the recommended levels are 800 to 1400. So the question is, should we use CO2 more in the flowering stage? And if not, why? And I'd probably like to direct this over to Ryan Wankel. If you guys could go ahead, we'll begin.
Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Hola, hey, aloha, bonjour. I'll start it out. I think that we're all probably going to have probably a lot to be able to answer this question. I think we're all probably going to have some different inputs as far as recommended CO2 levels. For myself, the CO2 in veg can be recommended for a lot of different things. If you're growing really high density crops, typically vertical grows. If your outside ambient CO2 is fairly low, you will find in commercial facilities that growers will supplement lower levels of CO2. Typically, I recommend anywhere between 4 and 600, but it's going to be acknowledged with what light levels that you're also achieving in veg. If you're running between 3 and 400 micromoles of light, you're going to be running really the lower side of CO2. If you're pumping anywhere between 5 and 600, you can be supplementing upward to about 700 ppms of CO2 in your environment. The thing that I look for in CO2 in the veg room is sometimes cultivar or strain specific, or chemovar as we would like to educate the public on. That you'll find that some plants that have a tendency to stretch will start to stretch if they have that extra levels of CO2. Sometimes that's a desired characteristic, sometimes not. I think there's a lot of study work on showing the levels of CO2 with increased lighting intensity. So I think that we all probably agree on the sense, and as us panelists, that increased lighting levels is going to require increased levels of CO2. If you're running 900 ppfd or micromoles on the canopy, you are going to be running about 1,000 ppm with CO2. But I do say watch if you are utilizing CO2 within that veg space and you have a lack of ambient air because you have a completely closed loop system. Watch out for stretching on certain strains.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I think another point to make is, when a person's environment is correct and your temperatures are correct within the grow space, you'll most typically see extremely quick growth rates in most chemovars. So it more of a cautionary tale in that before you start to add CO2, make sure that everything else is perfected within the environment, because you may find that it masks an issue or masks a problem environmentally within the facility that could overall be helping your plants grow more effectively, faster, and healthier.
And if I can just add some more boring stuff, when we look at photosynthesis, up until you hit sort of 500 micromoles per meter squared per second, CO2 is not the limiting factor. Once you get to those higher light intensities, then CO2 becomes a limiting factor, and so you want to add that ingredient into photosynthesis. And at the same time, as you increase your CO2, you want to make sure you're also increasing your temperature, because that's the energy that's going to be needed to convert, in the pathway of photosynthesis. The other thing, I just want to make sure that people recognize that if you are a breeder or even running CO2 in your propagation room, you want to be a little bit careful. If you get elevated levels of CO2 in your mothers, they will gradually decide to put out less and less stomates on their leaves, and so you could be creating a situation in which your next propagation of plants are going to have less stomates. So your vapor pressure deficit is going to be more difficult to control.
Yeah, I never ran it in the commercial room myself in my veg space. I had enough from negative draft of, and positive pressure, that enough air that was seeping in naturally, but it's very dependent on your...
And when you're using a living soil, you get an ambient CO2 level that's a little bit higher as well, right? Because you've got all the microbes in the soil, they're going to respire, you're going to get probably close to 700 just naturally with a living soil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's what Ryan was going to say before he froze.
Well, I'm going to present next a cultivation question coming from a client in Australia. I'm going to throw this over to you, Adam, Randy. The question is, can you recommend the best way to germinate and plant autoflowers?
Everybody has a different methodology for germinating their seeds. I drop mine and I like to drop them in a little bit of water for no more than 12 hours, I pull them out, and then I put them into a pot. With an autoflower, I would pot it into its final pot typically. I don't like to transplant autoflowers at all if I can help it. So maybe a pot, 5 gallons. I'd say I just recently saw some beautiful autoflowers finished in 3.9 gallon pots. So anywhere from 3.9, let's say, to a 7 gallon pot would be more than sufficient for most, and let it germinate right in the pot. Allows all the energy of that seed as it germinates to go into sending that taproot down. There's no fear of having that taproot bottom out in a smaller pot before I transplant it or anything like that.
Yeah, so I'm essentially very similar to how you would do other photoperiod seeds. I do like to use 3% kelp extract solution to soak my seeds, and I'll soak them for 12 to 18 hours. Part of that is just to help with the gibberellic acid that's in the sea kelp. It kind of helps root growth. And then I kind of do the paper towel method because I don't have a lot of success just dropping seeds in soil. So I wait until you get about maybe a quarter inch of the radicle peeping through the seed, and then I gently place it into some soil. And as Randy said, try to get it in the final pot size. I'm not big on transplanting autoflowers. It can be done, and if it is done, just make sure you don't disturb the roots. Oftentimes, you may, if you're using a soil, you might want to use some mycorrhizal inoculant just to help it along.
Okay. All right, moving on, we're going to head over into a lightning question coming out of the Midwest USA. Question is, it's up for grabs for any of you. Please give as much guidance on how to grow different cannabis strains under LEDs where you can control individual light spectrum intensities. How do you know where to set each spectrum for each strain? Ready, set, go.
Ryan, do you want me to lay this out for you to take over? I just want to make a really quick point. First off, when we think about transitioning from other lighting, let's say HPS and metal halide to LED, a lot of us get an LED in our hands right off in the beginning that's adjustable, and we go, what do we do with this? All of a sudden, it's like we've forgotten everything that we used to know. We always would run metal halide. Historically, we'd oftentimes run metal halide early on in veg, and at the end of flower, maybe for the last 2 weeks or last week, and we'd run HPS in between. And we were doing that because we were shifting the color spectrum, right? So we already knew that blue was good for veg and red was better for flower, but we didn't intimately understand all the little intricate details of that at that point. But we were still doing it. Right, so most of us that have grown have a basic knowledge of where the spectrum needs to be. Now we have to learn how to tweak it and tinker with it a bit, and that's where somebody like Ryan comes in. That's just a photobiologist.
Yeah, I think you're right on. I guess for setting the foundation. We touched a lot of this on our specific lighting webinars. But with a real quick, real recap for myself, how when we go about creating, we talk about strain-specific, lighting strategies or recipes. I like to use strategies because we all know that, between each one of the different phenotypes of these strains, they can vary so greatly across the board that, my, ghost train haze that I'm growing here in Colorado is going to be different than the ghost train haze that I see popping around growing in all of the LPs around Canada. So then it's starting to create a baseline or a lighting strategy, really understanding, watching your plant on how it goes. For myself, how we started, we really would look at where that plant's really coming from geographically, located really in its outside environment. So a lot of the times you have to do your own little bit of digging into its background, its parents' plant, and then the parents of those parents' plant to really truly understand, okay, is this a plant that's came, from very close, more from northern parallel to an equatorial-based plant. So really starting to dig back into the history of some of the genetics of where some of these strains came from, and then understanding what type of light that plant was exposed to over time. We talked about the exposure of, far red as one of these particular wavelengths that you can have a lot. There's a lot that you can actually do with it, and each strain is going to react slightly different. And you'll find a lot of those strains are strains that did grow in Northern California, that were bred up into the hills, that had inconsistent light levels, high levels of far red within the atmosphere. When was that far red present? Was it really present in the morning because of the angle of the way the sun was coming in, and also really heavily in the evening will have a lot to play of when you actually will apply that far red. But also understanding, what is your end goal that you're going for? If you are just going for strictly yield, then you need to understand that cannabis is light hungry, and the more light that you give it, it typically will relate into yield. Now, does it make sense financially to just continue to dump more light? Sometimes it does not. Obviously there is a return that you get by what you're putting in. So understanding what is that business case. If you're looking for yield, it is really all about increased lighting levels and photons. If you're looking for a high quality product, we will, sunrise, sunset, really go into the natural aspect. And we did, I would definitely recommend checking out the more lighting specific section we talked about with the other growers, but I'd say that's my quick answer to that, and hopefully it was beneficial.
Okay, well, we have another lighting question coming out of the UK, specifically for you, Ryan. Can you break down the PPFD measurements by weeks for the flowering 8 weeks?
So it is going to, that can vary. It depends on, are we focusing on ideal growth for the plant? Are we focusing on yield? Typically, I like to recommend that growers get to their highest level of recommended PPFD within that first 5 days of flowering. I find that any time that you start to increase lighting after that, it really starts to, if yield is your primary driving focus, that you will find a decreased yield. So I will make a nice transition going into flowering. If I'm running, roughly in my current setup, I'm running roughly around 450 PPFD into veg. So when I move into flowering, I'm trying to push around 700 for those first 4 days, and then increase upwards to between 9 to, depending if I have my CO2 levels cranking in some strains, I can and will go up to 1100 PPFD within that 5 day period. If your plants are healthy, if there's any sort of stress or your indicas, I can find that say they like a little less light than your sativas do. So your sativas, you can find that, you can increase it to, 1,000 micromoles, and your indicas you can run at, between 8 and 9. But, I think that it is important to say that you do need to have CO2 present. Your environment needs to be dialed in. The higher light levels that you have, the smaller margin of error that you have. If you have any sort of drought stress or anything, your margin of error goes very, very small. And I think, Randy, you like to run a little bit sometimes lower levels of light.
Yeah, I tend to. More recently, I think exactly because of what you stated, that I was running more of a indica heavy hybrids. If I was to run some long flowering sativas, I would definitely want to start dabbling with increasing that substantially.
Just to clarify, or make it a little bit easier if you're talking indica sativa, I think you're referring more to kind of the narrow leaves versus the broad leaves, right? Narrow leaves can usually handle higher light intensity, where the broadleaf plants are going to use a slightly lower light intensity.
Exactly, and when we really think about it, that's an evolutionary thing more likely than not. That there was just ridiculously higher light levels in the areas that those plants were where their origins came from. If you think of an indica and maybe in a mountainous region where there's trees growing up over top of it, as Rhonda mentioned earlier with talking about red light, fire red, stands to reason. Yeah.
But also just really then to go into the question, more, I know growers that will leave those increased light levels almost all the way up until harvest. Obviously a lot of growers typically will do that with HPS because they usually don't have an option, or it's too big of a pain or burdensome to go and turn down each of those ballasts, down increased lighting levels those last 2 to 3 days. But if you are looking for an increased quality product, if you're finding that your particular strain is not finishing quite, and you're still getting some foxtailing or some, white stigmas that come out, you can usually listen to your plants and start to decrease that lighting level just like you would in a nature's sense. I typically will do that the last week. I find anything that's longer than that period of time, I will start to find a decrease in yield just because the plant is so hungry for light, even at those last stages of growth. But if I was to recommend, lowering my light levels, I would probably decrease them by 50%, depending on if I was running, 900 micromoles, I'd probably cut it down to, around 500 those last 2 to 3 days. Just to kind of increase that finishing of the plant, maybe increase that quality a little bit, but that can go hand in hand if how you're feeding and all those into production treatments and that you're kind of doing at that end to increase that quality of plant. So I would run that high light levels all the way up until really that last week of flowering if you're looking for focusing on some yield.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have a question coming to you, Ab. It's coming from Canada. For soil-based regulated cultivators in a humid climate, what is the best way to prevent powdery mildew? And if identified early, what approved product with HC is the best to use? If it's an HVAC problem, what should they do?
Great. I'll defer the HVAC to Randy. Tackling the first comment there about soil-based, that's interesting because I think there's this assumption that soil-based cultivation is going to lead to more microbial populations, and that's not necessarily the case. I think it comes down to management and cultivation techniques. So one of the things that we highly recommend if you are using a soil-based, a living soil system, is that you move away from any top watering. And that's double purpose. I mean, a lot of people still, especially in the craft cannabis, are doing some hand watering. There's inevitably, there's some splash up, so you can get some soil particles, soil microbes going up on the leaf and moving around that way. But also, when you do that top watering, you are creating an ideal environment for bacteria and other microbes to populate that top 2 inches. And so what we would rather see is that you move to a sub-irrigation system, and whether that's using something like blue mat or capillary mats, it just allows for that top 2 inches to kind of dry up. Typically, you'll find with a lot of living soils, especially the just add water soils, they're high in salts. You're going to create an inhabitable environment in that top 2 inches because it's not going to get wet. And you're not going to have a lot of microbial activity up there. If inevitable, and Randy will probably speak to the HVAC issues and environment being so critical in controlling powdery mildew, Health Canada does have some really good products out there. What they recommend or allow, oftentimes, we probably start with something like Xeritol. Xeritol is I believe it's hydrogen peroxide and peroxylic acid. Cyclone is another product that is, back in the day, and probably a lot of people in their gardens right now would use milk. Whether it's whole milk, raw milk, whatever, they would often use milk as a fungal deterrent. I can't recommend that. Not that haven't used it, but I can't recommend it. But that's essentially what cyclone is. Cyclone's a lacto-fermented, whey protein. So that works incredibly well. And then a lot of people will use Millstop, which is potassium bicarbonate. And they all have some efficacy, but once again, avoidance is the best policy, which speaks a lot to your environmental conditions. So, just lastly, in terms before I turn over to Randy, I do think it's important to make sure you've got good calcium levels, good silica levels. That's going to help provide a really strong cell wall structure, which is one of your first defenses against powdery mildew.
Yeah, good points. I mean, yeah, the mitigation of it to begin with is going to start with that plant health, but it also is going to encompass some environmental conditions being correct. So as long as in flower your humidity isn't in excess of 55% humidity, and that it's not lower than that 50% humidity, lower is bad, higher is bad, and that you don't have temperature swings. I do everything in Fahrenheit for cannabis, so temperature swing no more than 8 degrees. I've seen anything over that start to proliferate the powdery mildew. So a person really has to watch their min-max temperatures, daytime, nighttime, your humidities, daytime, nighttime, and make sure that they're in check. And if all of that is in check, and bearing in mind that, historically, I was always taught in the legacy market that, your nighttime temperatures, you want them cooler. There's lots of white paper studies done now regarding the fact that the photosynthetic rate in the daytime at 83 degrees Fahrenheit was the peak for cannabis. So to keep the leaf temperature at 83 degrees, they also found that at night that same temperature was what the plant wanted to. It's not necessarily, I don't know if I would have the terminology likely for it. It's not necessarily photosynthesis where the sun's not going on, but its process is no different than a human sleeping at night. Our body goes through a lot of stuff at night. It's still working. We're sleeping. It's working for us. So the plants, essentially, think of the plant doing the same thing. So at night, if we went to bed and it's super cold, well, we're just not comfortable. We don't have a good sleep. But if you can go right to bed and it's the same temperature as what it was and everything stayed equal all night long, you'd have a great sleep. Plants same way. They're gonna respond better, be healthier. So between that environment and making sure that your temperature is always correct and your humidities don't get in excess or too low, you shouldn't see that powdery mildew start to proliferate.
Yeah, and I just love Randy's analogies. One other thing I want to just emphasize is sanitation. Sanitation is still incredibly critical. So whether that's cleaning your rooms in between, now powdery mildew is an obligate microbe, so it kind of needs to be living on living things. But things like bacteritis can survive on non-living things for a while. So it's really important to do that sanitation. Air purification. There are a lot of products out there, whether it's photocatalytic ionization of the air, some filtering of the air. There's a lot of great products out there. And then just always really important to remember that you actually have to clean out your ducts. It's amazing how many people kind of forget about that. QAs don't go out there and start swabbing the duct work to check to see if you've got some problems in there. So it's really important to keep your rooms as clean as possible.
Okay, we're going to have a question filling over to you, Randy. It's multi-tiered, but coming out of Canada, what are some of the best types of soil to use when growing a plant? What are the top 5 to 10 tools that someone should have in their kit in order to work with the plant during harvest? And what are some of the best ways to deal with the changes regarding regulatory licensing on the employee level?
Okay. I love living soils. I have for several years now, so I'm quite into any living soil-based system that there's lots of them out there. I don't want to start name dropping living soils, but the whole thought process is that the plant evolved with soil for millions of years. it's co-evolved with the microlife in that soil. So if you can provide a soil with microlife present that the plant can speak to, the plant can then communicate with the soil. So it's important to have a robust soil so far as nutrient load organically, and the microlife to then help break that nutrient load down, I guess, on a very basic level. All these questions that people have, if you feel we haven't answered enough of it that you'd like to hear, our email addresses, I think, are all going to be available, probably phone numbers. You pick up the phone, give a call. We'll complete the conversation. The tools at harvest time, was it harvest time? Or just in general?
Yes.
Harvest time. Well, I'm going to do some harvest ones, but in general tool, laser thermometer is priceless in a facility. They're dirt cheap, so you can shoot the top of the canopy of the plant and see what the temperature is on the leaf. It help you kind of guide your environment. During harvest, some pruners, I guess, to get your plants down. Gloves, face masks. If you're not wearing long sleeve shirts, get some long sleeves on so you're not getting arm hair in there and having somebody claim it's not arm hair. And just I think it's about the PPE that a person's going to be wearing to keep contaminants away from the cannabis. We could go into different trimmers, but that's a whole other conversation. So some sort of a mechanical trimmer, if it's commercial, is probably required, or a whole big trim team, depending on how much you have to trim, right? You could have a bunch of people sitting there trimming. That's entirely possible. It all comes down to size of facility. So, and the regulatory thing on, I don't know how the regulatory changes would affect employees, really. They shouldn't really they should be buffered from that unless it's directly affecting them, but I haven't seen any of it directly affect employees in Canada. Have you?
No, I'm not familiar with anything. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but
I could be too. If so, call us. We'll go back over it.
Just a few other comments around some of the tools. Depending if this is in the regulated space or in your home grow, I think it's great, especially if you're doing some pheno hunting, to of course have your jeweler's loupe to be looking at trichome color, knowing when best to harvest, and then especially if you can find some of these cannabinoid potency testers, it's great to be able to harvest at different times and kind of get a better feel for, am I grabbing this, am I harvesting the crop at the best time if it's peak cannabinoid content? And usually these THC, CBD potency testers are usually within 1% to 2% of what you might get at a lab. So it's just another tool. It's an expensive tool, but it's a tool for you to use, especially to learn the particular phenotype that you have and making sure that you're harvesting at the best time.
That's a great point.
Great, I got a question that can be for any one of you coming out of New Zealand. How to determine the optimum length of the vegetative phase?
That's a broad answer. It all comes down to quality of cannabis that you want to produce, I think. And this is only my opinion, but if a person wants to produce a commodity cannabis and just roll it out the door, then a very short veg period is adequate. Maybe a week, maybe less, maybe 2 weeks. If you want to produce a full range of cannabinoids, if you want to produce the plant's genetic potential for the full range of cannabinoids that it can produce, then I believe it has to go through at least that 4-week veg period, and I'll explain why. It's like a baby trying to, we'll do it in a bit of an analogy, it's like a baby being born, and all of a sudden, you don't let it crawl, you don't let it do anything until it's able to walk, and then you try to teach it to walk. It doesn't learn all the stages to be able to do what it needs to do when it gets older. The plant is very similar. Oftentimes, I guess if we're talking cloning, and oftentimes we are when we have this discussion of veg times. A clone coming off a plant is essentially a baby. It has to go through all these life cycles, life stages in order to be able to produce enough cannabinoids, or the proper cannabinoids, or a robust cannabinoid profile. Oftentimes people say a clone is an adult version of the plant that it came from. Everything's the same. But think of it as a human. If you're a human and you get a clone, or you're a sheep and you get a clone of a sheep, you don't. If you get that clone in the mail, you don't get a sheep in the mail. You get a zygote, right? You have to raise that sheep. It has all the same exact genetic makeup, but the sheep has to go through all the life stages to become a big sheep and look like the adult sheep that it was before. It just doesn't show up adult. The same thing with the clone. We're cutting the clone off. It has to grow roots. It has to go through a bunch of life stages before it can actually produce what an adult could produce. And so, in my opinion, I believe you have to have that good 4-week veg period for a fully mature, able to produce all the cannabinoid plant. I'm sure there's other opinions around the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so dependent. I mean, that can be, as Randy states, that's his belief, what he finds very effective for him. Obviously, we all know think different ways for different strokes for different boats, as they would say. I'm not going to disagree with Randy. I'd say that industry standard, I think we find a month. I like the way he explains it. I do find that we find a industry standards a month, but it depends on a lot of other factors than just your quality. We talked about, we've had this conversation. We've talked about regulations. What is your regulations that you are abiding by? Are you a caregiver like myself here in Denver, or another spot where you're very limited to a plant count? You're obviously going to be growing fairly large trees. I just don't know anybody who takes a 12 plant count and does a sea of green with 12 plants with a week-long veg time, where you do see a commercial facility where quality might not be their highest priority in their facility or their business plan, where short veg time, a very high density crop, the less veg time, less money invested in it, less hands that have been touched to it. But that also then requires a large plant count, which some people just don't have. So I think regulations can dictate your veg period and what's ideal for your specific situation. Also, what is your facility footprint? For myself, fortunately, I didn't have the luxury of designing some of these facilities that I ran in Denver, where I kind of inherited what was, already kind of set in stone, and obviously things weren't going well, or that team would have still been put in place where I didn't have to come and take those over. But for some of those particular situations, some of these facilities were created without a veg room. So in those particular sense, I had to kind of treat as each one of my plants as kind of a mother plant. I didn't have the space, so I had to have a long veg cycle. We were vegging for 3 months at Pink House. And actually, when I first got there, they were vegging for about 4 months. And we were trying to find ways to cutting down costs, because obviously the longer they're in, they're taking up real estate. There is an overhead that each one of those plants go with how long that you're vegging. And so but again, we didn't have a mother space. We had to treat each one of those plants. We had to grow them tall enough so then we could have enough cuttings off of that, final 3 weeks before we flipped them. So I think it could be very dependent on space and regulations. Some people just don't want to do sea of green if your local regulations require you to weigh each plant. And if you're doing a density of 49 plants, because you're doing a true sea of green, 49 to 63 plants in 1.2 square meters, you are really looking at a veg time of 5 to 7 days. But then that decision needs to be driven by other factors. So shorter veg time, you're obviously going to need to have more plants for a high density. You're going to need more clones. You're going to need a bit larger mom space. So it's my quick skinny on it.
All right, and getting the quick skinny on the next question for many of you. So tell us your experience on how different growing methods and how it relates to final THC. What methods give the highest THC bang for your buck?
I think there's probably going to be no disagreements. You have a bunch of soil growers and soilless growers here on the panel. So I think that it's in a biased answer. I think that we're all going to lean towards either a soil or a soilless mix. I myself still do a soilless mix because I like to be able to still control some of the fertigation in some of the varieties that I like, but I'm not going to by far discredit the product that I've seen and the product that I've been able to see and taste of what comes off of living soil or no-till soil situations and solutions. But I think it comes to how you're treating your plant, what environmental tricks that you're doing, because whether it's hydroponic or soil, you can. I think they're, as far as chemical profiles, are starting to become pretty even on at least THC and CBD. Terpenes, I think, is another story.
Okay, I'm going to switch it up, take a couple live questions that have come in.
Sorry, do you mind if I'm just going to add a little to that?
Yeah.
Discredit me as somebody who's a promoter of living soils, but I really do feel, and Randy's already embarrassed that I'm going to say this, but soluble nutrients. If you pump a cannabis plant with soluble nutrients, that NPK mentality, I think you'll drive a lot more of one particular cannabinoid. So you can really drive your THC by pumping it with a lot of NPK. Now it's risky. It's definitely you're affecting the immune system of the plant. You're going to impact the terpenes. But some of the work that Mark Lewis has done out of NAPRO really just showing that with a lot of conventional nutrients or soluble nutrients, you can really get some high levels of THC. So even if you are using a living soil, maybe hitting it with some extra soluble nutrients through teas or whatnot, you can definitely drive your THC. It's not going to be as robust. You're probably not going to get other cannabinoids. You're not going to get the terpenes as much, but you'll get some high THC.
Okay, well, we had 2 comments come in based on the last 2 or 3 questions. One of them being, I think temperature is also very important in the veg stage. And I saw an increase in temperature that can change the plant maturity and canopy height. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we're going to be talking about VPD in any of the situations when you're talking, whether it's traditional lighting or LED. Of course, LED, you're going to need to run a warmer room. I suggest running a higher humidity into those veg stages to be able to control that VPD. For me, when it comes to temperature control and heights, you're going to be looking at the diff. So that's going to be your difference between your daytime temperatures and your nighttime temperatures. So in average, usually I always give this an example that in the summer when it's really hot and typically, all of everybody's HVAC systems, especially early on, I think now things are, a lot of HVAC professionals out there, people work with them so their facilities don't have issues, but sometimes your room runs warmer during the day because it's hot and your HVAC has a hard time just trying to be able to keep up in general. And then usually the grower will try to run a cooler night because they're like, all right, if I run a cooler night and I start the beginning of the day really, really cool, it'll take so much longer for my HVAC can try to keep up to that end of the day, but it never really works like that if you have a problem with your HVAC system, which is never good. But the example is you have a higher daytime temperature when your lights are on, and then you have a lower nighttime temperature, your plants are going to stretch like crazy. And so then you see in the summer so many stretching problems that you go into a grow facility. It's the first thing that I can go in and be like, ooh, these guys have an HVAC issue. Because I know they're running, I've been there myself. That's the reason why I know. I think that's what Randy always says, humility is usually the best form of education, because you've been there and done that, so you can instantly know, all right, I go in there and see a stretching problem, they're having HVAC problems. I try to run a neutral diff, so I basically try to run the same daytime temperatures and the same nighttime temperatures during that veg stage to try to just get that natural growth out of it. You could actually run a warmer nighttime temperature. So in my HPS environment, I would run a warmer environment during that veg stage. I actually did metal halide for my veg stage, but I would run a warmer nighttime environment because of the natural stretch on legacy lighting, just so I could combat to try to get less stretching. So there's the opposite effect. If you run a warmer night temperature than day, you're going to have less stretching versus a cooler night temperature, you're going to increase stretching.
Good for the next question? All right, coming in live. Can you speak to the benefits of canopy light penetration, if any, and how that differs between HPS and LED? Up for grabs.
Yeah, Ryan, you got some great information on green light.
Yeah, I think we touched a little bit on some different, out there between LED and HPS and between any lighting fixture at hood, you really need to focus on a light plan because there are different solutions for different growers' needs. And each of those different solutions, whether it's a form factor, whether that form factor, I'm talking LED, a specific diode angle, each one of us manufacturers usually have different solutions that will throw the light or direct the photons in a different way or an angle. So it's important when you're utilizing and looking at light to really understand what is that solution for. Particularly how at HPS and how really relatively they've been working so well in the cannabis industry is we throw them up on the ceiling and the photons get directed all around because the hood really is just throwing all the photons in all the angles. So that allows to get a lot of good cross light, so that penetrates deep within the canopy because the plant's not absorbing all of that light, thus with green light, which we talk about the benefits of green light and it penetrating the canopy. That green light's not 100% really absorbed by the leaf itself. So not only will some photons actually, go through the leaf itself, but they'll reflect down into the canopy. So in an HPS system, if your photons are getting thrown at all these different angles, and you're getting light from this light over here and light from this light over here, and still receiving light from your top, now those photons, when they're not 100% absorbed, they're going to reflect down into that same angle that they typically come into. Thus why you'll see a lot of really large, dense canopies within HPS because of the green light and because of the way they're throwing photons. Now, vice versa, if you're looking at, say, these bar style fixtures of LEDs or, modular designs, it's really what are you looking for in an application? If your light source is coming pretty much straight up and down at a very narrow angle, when it hits that leaf surface, it typically reflects back onto that. So, in a non-vertical situation, I look for, LED lighting solutions that are, that can direct the photons a little bit more out, where I can utilize a little bit more of the cross lighting from other fixtures, similar to how HPS will throw the light. So really looking at your lighting plan and really abiding by it, I think is super important. And we touched on some of those in the lighting webinar as well, so definitely highly encourage it, and happy to take all this conversation offline because I think it's really important for what you're looking for into your solution. Photon level, have a light meter is going to be key in commercial facilities, so you can truly see what you're running under there, and not just having an assumption. So it's very, very key. So I hope I answered. I could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, we had a quick follow-up question come through on the live panel. Following up on that, many cultivars have been bred under HPS. Can you speak to some that have been bred under LED or ones that perform well under LED? Maybe some tips on how to adapt cultivars from HPS to LED.
I don't know if it's so much adapting the cultivar from HPS to LED as much as it is the grower. Oftentimes, I always look at myself as being the limiting factor here. The plants as long as you're not exceeding your PPFD that we typically would give a plant, and you're keeping your environment correct, that you're providing the plant what it needs. So it comes down to how your plant's going to react, or the morphology, the way it grows under one light versus another. So you may find that a plant that typically you could veg for 2 to 3 weeks and it would be 18 inches is now 12 inches tall. But it may be just because you're using more blue light in that situation, in that LED that you're running. So you have to start to understand how your chemovirus will react under that new light, and then react to it, I guess, is I don't know if that answers it completely or not.
Yeah, I think that we have a lot to learn. I do tend to think that we really need to have more selective breeding and, pheno hunting, as we say, under LED. I could tell you the huge differences that, in some of the pheno hunting projects, when, you're popping 200 of the same strain, and seeing those differences at firsthand, I can tell you that I know they're going to react differently from an LED environment. I'm yet to know of a breeder that is, I try to encourage working on, with a lot of my breeder friends, of working on an LED line, because I do see it as a huge opportunity to be able to get into the market. A lot of times when we go into these, we do get asked for recommendations for, what strains that we find that work really well under LED. I think that, as Randy says, I think it can be mainly a grower thing. I can tell you my OG Kush breath, I've never been able to grow quite like I've been able to use it under an HPS, but I don't think that it's been a negative thing. The chemical profile is actually a little bit better, and the plants has seemed to, if we'd say, evolve over time, that that the plants do tend to get used to the light. The one more interesting things that I found is when you throw an LED, even an HPS room, and it's never the most ideal, you're going to find that plant, even under that HPS light, is going to be like reaching for that light of LED. That it is just such more utilized light that the plant really actually enjoys it. But I think that there's a lot of selective breeding that needs to be done for even more success for LED continuing into the future. But I think that's stable genetics too, that we just have, the cannabis breeding community has a lot of growing and understanding to do. Those 200 different strains, the 200 of the same strains are all varied. It's not like a package of Cherokee purple tomatoes that you go and you get and you start for your garden, where you're going to get that Cherokee purple or that heirloom variety. It's just not the same.
Okay, we have our next question going to be directed towards Ryan, but everyone's able to answer based on environment coming out of Canada. What is the peak cannabinoid harvest time in terms of trichome appearance? What changes to environmental conditions, temperature, lighting, RH, are made in the days before harvest?
Cool. This is a really long question to be able to answer that we'll all have. I think that people are going to have separate and different opinions. Randy kind of touched on it. I would recommend, I know I've touched on it a few times, to go check out the first webinar that I actually was on with Randy, where we talked about some end of production treatments. You're going to get all of those temperature drops of relative humidity and what we're going to do to kind of increase that quality of product, because I will do a decreased night temperature drop there at the end before harvest to increase cannabinoids, also some specific fertigation techniques and so on. Now, a harvest appearance of trichomes is a very tricky situation that I think Randy kind of pointed out, that maybe actually Av actually pointed, if you have the ability for chemical analysis to be able to truly harvest at different times, you really take some data approach to what is this peak harvest time, really getting your THC, your cannabinoids, your terpene contents, seeing at what time are those levels increased? Of course, your customers are going to be able to work hand in hand. That's another data point that you can utilize, that if you take your chemical analysis with some customer review, then you're going to also find that you might find a different peak harvest time than what you might consider. You know, most of the time I find growers, you'll range between the 20 to 30% range of amberine trichome heads. And then your plant's going to, typically have another 10% to 15% of amberine as it's drying or curing. So you're trying to hit roughly maybe 40% amber crystals, but it's so dependent on each of your strains that if you're talking an indica, the harder that you go and more amber, you're going to start to go over that bell curve. You're going to have way more of a kind of a body type high that might last a little longer versus, say, if you're growing a sativa where you might pull harvest your sativa slightly earlier on those stages because you want a real cerebral and head high that doesn't last that long, or clarity. So there's a lot of factors that can go into it. And I want to let Randy, because I know Randy and Av, we've had this conversation before we finish up. So like they're quick.
I think you hit it on the head. I think it's very personal when it gets harvested, what you want from it. Some people may harvest weeks early in order to harvest a precursor to one of the cannabinoids in higher quantity. It really comes down to the end use of the product, I think. We have talked to people lately who have the ability to test as they go and have seen not a correlation in THC degradation or dropping of THC and CBN going up. So the THC and CBN don't seem to have a direct correlation to one another. They do in some regards, but it's not a 1-to-1 ratio that they're gaining and losing. So we really, it's showing that some people, you may want to take it to that 50% amber trichrome or 40% before you start your dry, and maybe if you had the ability to test, you see that the THC percentage goes up all the way to the end, when we thought that maybe it didn't historically. But it's not the same. Like you said, indica, sativa is going to be different. So it becomes a very personal thing.
And all I would add is oftentimes we hear about pushing sort of potassium at the end. I think that's important, but it's also important to, I think, feed the roots. Typically, that's where I would hit it with some extra calcium, perhaps maybe not in the Rockwell system, but I'd also add molasses. So just trying to feed the roots, keep the roots healthy. I think that just leads to a healthier finish.
All right, gentlemen, that's going to be a wrap for today. We have run out of time. Personally, and everyone would like to thank you for your time today. I think this has been one of the best webinars so far. Content's been great. So just for our audience out there, to remind you all, if we did not get to your question or you posted a new question live, there will be an email coming to you or a phone call following up with you. Everyone will get an email with a copy of this session. We also will have a link for you to register for upcoming webinars. We are going to continue them while we're all living and dreaming quarantine. So the next one on June 2nd is going to be Understanding GACP and GMP in Commercial Cannabis. This will be an excellent one as well. Hope that you will join us. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and we will see you on the next session. Take care, everyone.
Okay.